My father told the jury I had been feeding on my dead mother's money for years. He said it with the confidence of a man who thought this county still belonged to him. He thought my silence meant I had nothing. He thought the woman in the black robe was just another visiting judge. He had no idea she was one of the very few people in America who already knew exactly who I was. My name is Nova Galloway. I am 38 years old, and as I sit at the defendant's table in the suffocating heat of the Blackmere County Courthouse, I am listening to my father swear under oath that I am a thief. Calvin Galloway does not just speak, he preaches. He leans into the microphone, the harsh fluorescent lights catching the silver in his perfectly combed hair, and he tells the 12 men and women in the jury box that I spent the last 2 years of my mother's life siphoning her personal accounts dry. He says I stole from a dying woman. He says I stole from my own flesh and blood. He delivers this lie with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who still believes he owns this entire county. For nearly 3 decades, Calvin did own it. He was the chairman of the local land board. He decided whose zoning permits were approved, whose businesses thrived, and whose properties were condemned. He is a man who is deeply accustomed to using his reputation as a blunt instrument to crush anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. Today, that person happens to be his eldest daughter. I do not scream. I do not object. I do not even shake my head. Instead, I reach out with a steady hand, pick up the plastic cup of ice water resting on the scarred wooden table in front of me, and take a slow, measured sip. When I lower the cup, I place it down onto the wood with such extreme care that it makes absolutely no sound. In a room crackling with manufactured outrage, my profound stillness is the most dangerous thing present. It is unnatural. It is not the reaction of a guilty woman caught in a lie, nor is it the panic of an innocent woman being framed. It is the patience of a predator waiting for the trap to snap shut. Calvin's attorney, Arthur Vance, paces in front of the jury box. He is wearing a suit that costs roughly $2,000, the kind of display Blackmere mistakes for credibility, and he waves a sheaf of bank statements in the air. Nova Galloway has no verifiable employment, Vance declares, his voice booming off the oak-paneled walls. She has no public footprint. She has no physical office that anyone can visit. For the past 15 years, she has floated from city to city, claiming to work as a consultant. Yet, when her mother, Lorraine Galloway, fell tragically ill, Nova suddenly reappeared, and magically, tens of thousands of dollars began vanishing from Lorraine's private estate accounts. Money meant for her care, funneled away by a daughter who had contributed nothing but absence. I allow my gaze to drift from Vance to the wooden pews in the gallery behind me. The courtroom is packed to maximum capacity. Half the town has shown up for the spectacle. Sitting in the very first row, directly behind the prosecution, is my younger sister, Piper Galloway. Piper is putting on a masterpiece of a performance. She is dressed in a muted, conservative black dress, clutching a damp tissue in her hands. Her shoulders shake with silent, photogenic sobs exactly when Vance mentions our mother's suffering. She has perfected the devastated look of the betrayed family member, the loyal youngest child who stayed behind to care for her parents while the wicked older sister ran off to the city. Piper acts as though she is simply a tragic victim in all of this, collateral damage in my supposed scheme. She looks at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, shaking her head as if the sheer weight of my cruelty is too much for her fragile heart to bear. I turn my attention away from my sister's theatrical grief and look up at the bench. The atmosphere in the room has been thoroughly stacked against me since the moment the bailiff unlocked the doors this morning. The local townsfolk, the jury, the bailiffs, they all believed Calvin's narrative before I even took my seat. To them, I am exactly what Arthur Vance claims I am. I am the prodigal daughter who abandoned her roots, failed at life, and slunk back into town just in time to sink my teeth into the family inheritance. But the one person in the room who is not from Blackmere County sits high above us all. The regular county judge had a sudden medical emergency 2 weeks ago. In his place, the state sent a visiting judge. Her name is Judge Miriam Weller, She is a woman in her late 60s with iron gray hair pulled back into a severe knot. Since the morning session began, she has barely spoken a word. She is incredibly still, her face a mask of absolute, chilling neutrality. She does not nod along with Calvin's emotional testimony. She does not offer sympathetic smiles to Piper. Judge Weller is currently flipping through the preliminary filings binder. I watch her carefully. I watch her eyes scan down the page detailing my defense's initial disclosures. Her gaze hits the official registered name of my corporate entity. It is a name that means absolutely nothing to Arthur Vance. It means nothing to Calvin. It means nothing to anyone in this town. But Judge Weller stops. Her eyes lock onto that single line of text. She does not blink for 3 full seconds. A muscle in her jaw tightens imperceptibly. She slowly lifts her head, bypassing the pacing lawyer, bypassing my grandstanding father, and she looks directly at me. Her expression remains entirely blank, but in that fleeting silent exchange, a current of electricity shoots down my spine. Judge Weller knows. Let me make something perfectly clear right now. I am not a poor woman. I am not a failure. I am not some desperate, unemployed drifter living out of a suitcase and scamming my dying mother for rent money. I possess a level of wealth and influence that would cause my father's heart to give out right here on the witness stand if he ever saw my actual financial portfolio. I simply operate in a profession that does not allow for bragging. I do not have a LinkedIn profile. I do not hand out glossy business cards at networking events. I work for an entity that handles the quiet, brutal restructuring of compromised assets. When massive corporations collapse into scandal, when federal injunctions freeze billions of dollars, when wealthy estates become entangled in criminal inquiries, my firm is called in to act as the invisible hand. We clean up the financial blood. We secure the assets under sealed court orders. We do not exist in the public eye because we cannot exist in the public eye. My entire adult life has been carefully engineered to leave zero public footprint. Calvin and his small-town lawyer think my lack of a public profile means I am a loser. They have mistaken my camouflage for emptiness. Mr. Galloway, Vance says, his voice softening into a tone of deep, manufactured empathy. He walks back to the witness stand and rests his hand on the wooden railing. Can you tell the jury what your late wife, God rest her soul, said to you during her final days regarding the defendant? I shift my focus back to my father. Calvin takes a deep, ragged breath. He brings a hand up to his face, pinching the bridge of his nose as if fighting back a wave of unbearable grief. It is a brilliant touch. The jury is completely mesmerized. Several of them are leaning forward, practically holding their breath. Lorraine was a good woman, Calvin says, his voice breaking perfectly on the word good. She loved both her girls. She tried so hard to understand Nova. She really did. But in those last few weeks, when she realized what was happening to her accounts, when she realized the money we had saved for her treatments was just gone. Calvin stops. He slowly lowers his hand. The simulated grief on his face vanishes, replaced by a cold, hardened stare. He raises his right arm and points his index finger directly across the courtroom. He points it dead at the center of my chest. My wife died with a broken heart, Calvin says, his voice now ringing out loud and clear, echoing off the high ceiling of the courtroom so that every single person in the gallery hears it. She looked at me from her hospital bed, knowing the end was near, and she cried. She told me she was going to her grave completely devastated that she had brought a daughter like Nova into this world. A collective gasp ripples through the courtroom. Someone in the back row whispers a harsh condemnation. Piper buries her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving. Arthur Vance nods solemnly, letting the sheer brutality of the statement hang in the heavy air. Calvin keeps his finger pointed at me, his eyes locked onto mine, daring me to break. He thinks this is the killing blow. He thinks he has completely destroyed me in front of everyone we know. He thinks the woman in the black robe sitting above us is just another small-town official ready to hand him whatever he wants. He has absolutely no idea what is coming for him. To understand the man standing in that courtroom, pointing his finger at me with such righteous indignation, you have to understand the dirt we were raised on. Blackmere County was not always filled with artisanal coffee shops and gated communities. When I was a child, it was defined by crushing humidity, swarms of mosquitoes, and hundreds of acres of prime, untouched wetland. We owned a small marina that smelled permanently of spilled gasoline and low tide, along with a sprawling, drafty inn perched right on the edge of the marsh. For a long time, it provided a modest working-class living. Then the new county zoning laws passed. The wetlands were reclassified for commercial development. Suddenly, the mud we had played in was worth millions of dollars. The marina was no longer just a place for locals to buy live bait. It became the designated gateway to an exclusive waterfront district. With that massive influx of sudden wealth came my father's desperate need to construct a local dynasty. And local dynasties require highly compliant heirs. Calvin Galloway had a very specific, inflexible blueprint for his daughters. We were supposed to attend the state college an hour away, join a respectable sorority, and come back to Blackmere to marry a local boy with a trust fund or a law degree. We were supposed to become the beautiful, gracious hostesses of the Galloway family legacy, organizing charity luncheons and bringing our well-dressed children to the country club every Sunday. I was labeled the difficult child because I looked at that blueprint and saw a heavily gilded cage. I wanted absolutely nothing to do with the country club politics. I had no interest in smiling politely at mediocre men who believed owning a boat dealership made them local royalty. My refusal was not loud, and I rarely engaged in screaming matches. It was simply a firm, immovable rejection of his entire worldview. To a man like Calvin, quiet defiance is far worse than a tantrum. It implies you do not even respect him enough to fight for his approval. My younger sister understood the currency of our household perfectly. Piper learned early on that agreeableness was a weapon, and she wielded it with terrifying efficiency. She played the part of the good daughter flawlessly. She stayed close to home. She dated the son of the local bank manager. She nodded enthusiastically whenever Calvin ranted about local property taxes over dinner. Piper figured out that if you just reflected Calvin's own opinions back to him, he would hand you the keys to the kingdom. Her compliance bought her a brand new luxury SUV on her 21st birthday, a fully funded down payment on her first house, and the permanent, unshakable title of the loyal, suffering child. She weaponized her pleasant demeanor to secure maximum privilege. My mother, Lorraine, watched all of this happen from the quiet corners of our home. People in town often thought my mother was meek. They mistook her silence for submission. Assuming Calvin's booming personality simply eclipsed her entirely, they were entirely wrong. Lorraine was incredibly observant. She was the one who managed the actual financial books for the marina, while Calvin took the local politicians out for expensive steak dinners. She knew exactly what I was capable of, and she knew I possessed a sharp, calculating mind that would suffocate if forced into the suffocating mold Calvin had built. She never openly defied him in public, but she would quietly leave complex business magazines on my bed or slip me articles about corporate finance. She knew I was not the mediocre, rebellious failure Calvin desperately wanted me to be. I realized very early that in the Galloway household, family love was not a birthright. It was a strictly conditional currency. If you obeyed, you were rewarded with public affection and deep financial backing. If you made your own choices, you were systematically erased from the family narrative. When I finally packed my bags at 22 years old and moved to a major city on the coast to begin my actual career, Calvin immediately began the rewriting process. He could not stand the idea that the town might think he had lost control of his eldest daughter. So, he crafted a fiction. If anyone at the country club asked how Nova was doing, Calvin would put on a tight, patronizing smile. He would tell them I was floating around, doing vague administrative work. He heavily implied I was a glorified secretary, hopping from one unstable office job to another, struggling to find my footing because I had foolishly rejected the safety net of Blackmere County. He made my life sound pitiful. He turned me into a cautionary tale of a girl who thought she was too good for her hometown and ended up with absolutely nothing to show for it. The erasure was not just verbal, it was physical and methodical. Every time I came back for a mandatory holiday visit, there was a little less of me in the house. First, my high school debate trophies disappeared from the living room mantel, quickly replaced by Piper's equestrian ribbons. Then, the framed newspaper clippings of my academic scholarships were taken down from the hallway, supposedly because the frames were clashing with the new wallpaper. Year by year, the physical evidence that I had grown up in that house, that I had achieved anything of merit, was quietly boxed up and shoved into the dark corners of the attic. Calvin was carefully curating a museum of his own success, and I was a glaring mistake he was meticulously airbrushing out of the exhibit. I never fought him on it. I let him have his empty walls and his fabricated stories. But I never cut ties with my mother. Our relationship existed in the negative space of Calvin's control. We did not have long, emotional phone calls where I confessed my deepest secrets. I could not tell her the names of the international clients I represented, or the massive corporate structures I was quietly dismantling under federal seal. But we had brief, 15-minute phone calls every Sunday morning before Calvin woke up. We exchanged text messages that seemed entirely mundane to anyone else, but carried heavy subtext between us. "Hope the weather is holding up," she would text. "Just finished a 48-hour sprint. The storm passed," I would reply. She knew I was not talking about the rain. She knew I was managing high-stakes crises. When I sent her an expensive silk scarf from Europe, she did not ask how a struggling temp worker could afford it. She just wore it to church and smiled when Calvin asked where she got it, telling him she found it at a vintage thrift shop. Lorraine knew her daughter was carrying the weight of a completely different, highly consequential world, even if she did not know the exact coordinates of that world. That silent understanding was the only thing that kept me tethered to Blackmere County. And then, she died. The day of my mother's funeral was unseasonably cold. After the burial, the entire town descended upon the Galloway house for the reception. The air was thick with the smell of casseroles, stale coffee, and the cloying scent of expensive lilies. I walked through the heavy oak front doors, dodging the sympathetic pats and the pitying glances of neighbors who still thought I was just the prodigal failure returning out of guilt. I moved away from the crowded living room, needing a moment to breathe away from the suffocating performance of small-town grief. I stepped into the central hallway, a quiet corridor that led to the bedrooms. I looked up at the spot on the wall right above the antique credenza. For 15 years, my university graduation photo had managed to survive there. It had been the last remaining, stubborn piece of evidence that I existed in this family. I looked at the wall, and the photo was gone. In its exact place, perfectly centered and freshly hung, was a cheap, mass-produced painting of a marshland. The reality of my existence was buried under layers of federal non-disclosure agreements. For over a decade, my actual employer was the Continental Receivership Authority. It is an organization that does not advertise. We operate under a heavily sanitized public shell known as Crown Ledger Advisory. When a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund collapses under the weight of its own fraud, or when a massive corporate estate becomes a crime scene, the courts do not call regular accountants. They call us. We are the architects of financial triage. My job requires me to parachute into the center of catastrophic fiscal failures, freeze the bleeding assets, and execute court-sealed restructuring plans. Because of the highly sensitive nature of the assets I handle, a public footprint is not just discouraged, it is a strict security violation. I do not have a social media presence. My name does not appear on public corporate registries. To my father and my sister, who measure a person's worth by the size of the brass plaque on their office door, I was a ghost. Calvin genuinely believed I spent my days drifting between rented desks in shared workspaces, taking dictation for startups that were destined to fail. Piper thought I was simply unemployable in any traditional sense. They had absolutely no idea that I was the only structural support keeping our family from total financial ruin. 7 years ago, a massive hurricane stalled over the coast, bringing historic storm surges that decimated the local boating industry. The family marina was underwater, both literally and financially. Calvin had over-leveraged the property to buy adjacent swampland, and the banks were circling to call in his loans. He was exactly 3 weeks away from a humiliating public bankruptcy. Then, Seemingly out of nowhere, an out-of-state holding company offered him a commercial bridge loan at a miraculously low interest rate of 3%. Calvin signed the papers, marched into the local diner, and loudly proclaimed that his decades of good standing and impeccable reputation had saved the family business. He called it a blessing from God. It was not a blessing. It was a highly fortified shell corporation that I had established using my own performance bonuses. I saved his empire, and I let him take the credit because I knew that if he found out the money came from the daughter he despised, he would have torn the check up just to spite me. 3 years after that, Piper nearly lost her beloved Marshland Inn. She had treated the operating budget like a personal slush fund, draining the accounts to maintain her image as a successful local entrepreneur. When the foreclosure notices arrived, she was terrified Calvin would find out she had failed. Suddenly, a boutique private equity fund specializing in distressed hospitality assets stepped in. They bought out her debt, restructured her repayment plan to a fraction of the cost, and allowed her to retain full ownership. Piper spent months bragging to her friends about how her incredible charm and business acumen had convinced these tough city investors to take a chance on her. She never knew I was the primary capital partner in that fund. I authorized the buyout from a hotel room in London while dismantling a corrupt shipping conglomerate. I let her keep her pride, just as I let Calvin keep his. I paid their debts, and in return, I allowed them to keep calling me a failure. It was the cost of doing business in the Galloway family, but the heaviest toll came when my mother's diagnosis was finally confirmed. Cancer is not just a biological disease, it is an aggressively efficient financial predator. When Lorraine required 24-hour private nursing and specialized respiratory equipment, Calvin balked. He looked at the monthly invoices, which easily exceeded $30,000, and began making quiet arrangements to move her into a state-run facility 2 towns over. He convinced himself it was the practical choice, ignoring the reality that the facility was chronically understaffed and entirely unequipped to manage her pain. He was willing to let his wife suffer so he would not have to sell a single acre of his precious, undeveloped land. I could not let that happen. However, I also knew that if I directly offered to pay, Calvin would violently reject the money. Accepting charity from the daughter he had spent years publicly degrading would have been a humiliation his ego could not tolerate. So, I built a ghost network. I routed hundreds of thousands of dollars through a series of anonymous legal trusts and charitable grants. I had a specialized medical liaison contact Calvin, informing him that Lorraine had miraculously qualified for a newly funded, entirely anonymous patient relief program. The program covered the private nurses. It covered the out-of-pocket costs for experimental therapies that ran $10,000 a dose. It covered everything. Calvin accepted it without a second thought, praising his own luck once again. But Lorraine was not Calvin. Lorraine paid attention. She spent her days lying in that adjustable bed, watching the machinery of her care operate with frightening efficiency. She noticed the exact timing of the funds arriving just hours before a deadline. She noticed that the experimental drugs, which usually required 6 months of aggressive bureaucratic appeals, were suddenly approved and delivered within 48 hours. She recognized the invisible hand moving the pieces on the board. She knew that kind of precision did not come from a generic charity. It came from someone who understood exactly how to manipulate complex systems. It came from me. We never spoke of it directly. To say the words out loud would have broken the fragile ecosystem we were surviving in. But the understanding passed between us in the quiet moments, in the way she would squeeze my hand when a nurse administered a treatment Calvin claimed he could never afford. She knew her difficult, invisible daughter was holding the sky up so the rest of the family would not be crushed. In the final months of her life, Lorraine did something completely out of character. She quietly arranged for a private meeting with an independent attorney, far away from Calvin's sphere of influence. She knew what Calvin would do the moment she was gone. She knew he would try to consolidate power, and she knew he would try to use her estate to finally and permanently punish me for my independence. So, Lorraine secretly amended the core structure of her personal trust. She did not leave me out, but she also knew Calvin would try to disqualify me by claiming I was unemployed or unstable. To counter him, she drafted a highly specific, ironclad stipulation. She added a clause stating that a beneficiary remained in perfect standing to inherit, provided they were actively engaged in professional services recognized by a competent authority or court, even if those services were not publicly disclosed. She wrote the exact legal definition of my life into her final will. When my mother passed away, she did not leave me a tear-stained letter filled with emotional apologies. She did not leave me a diary of her regrets. Instead, she left me something far more valuable. She left me a meticulously crafted, legally binding trap, lying in wait for the exact moment my father would attempt to distort the truth of my existence. The dirt on my mother's grave had not even settled before Calvin initiated the erasure of her autonomy. It took less than 24 hours for the mourning husband to transform into a wartime general securing occupied territory. Lorraine had kept a small, sunlit office at the back of the house, a room entirely her own where she managed the actual administrative heartbeat of the family. The morning after the reception, I walked down the hall and found a local locksmith drilling out the brass deadbolt on her door. Calvin stood behind him, his arms crossed, his face a mask of solemn duty. When he saw me watching, he did not flinch. He simply offered a heavy theatrical sigh and said he needed to gather her ledgers to keep the house stable while we were all grieving. He packed her files into heavy cardboard boxes and locked them in his own study. He was not just securing paperwork, he was suffocating her ghost. With the physical evidence of her life boxed away, Calvin took his campaign to the streets of Blackmere County. It was a masterpiece of soft, rural manipulation. In a town like ours, reputations are not destroyed in the town square. They are dismantled in the aisles of the local grocery store, over the buffets at the Sunday church luncheons, and leaning against the polished hoods of pickup trucks outside the hardware store. Calvin never yelled. He played the part of the weary, heartbroken patriarch to absolute perfection. When the local real estate brokers or the deacon from his congregation offered their condolences, Calvin would lower his voice, shake his head, and let the poison drip. "It is hard," he would say, looking out at the horizon with mournful eyes. "But what really breaks my heart is Nova. She barely called for 2 years. And now, the second the will is about to be read, she is suddenly sitting in my living room. I suppose some people can only smell family when there is money on the table." Piper was his eager lieutenant in this psychological warfare. She weaponized her position as the resident caregiver, dropping perfectly rehearsed sound bites to anyone who would listen at the local coffee shop. She would stir her latte, let her eyes well up with tears, and deliver half-truths that were impossible to definitively disprove. I was there every single day. Piper would tell the local gossips, her voice trembling just the right amount. I sacrificed my own life to hold her hand. Nova just showed up when she felt like it. She would breeze in, question the doctors, and then vanish back to the city. She always had this unbelievable attitude, like we were all just an inconvenience to her. It was a brilliantly executed narrative, designed to preemptively turn the entire town against me before the legal battle even began. But the smear campaign was merely the smoke covering the actual fire. Calvin was not just acting out of petty vindictiveness. There was a massive, highly lucrative catalyst driving his desperation. A few weeks before my mother passed, a rumor began circulating in the quiet, high-stakes circles of commercial zoning. A massive corporate conglomerate known as Red Shoal Development had been aggressively surveying the hundreds of acres of untouched wetland directly adjacent to our family marina. They were not looking to build a few summer cottages. They wanted to dredge the marsh, pour millions of tons of concrete, and construct a sprawling, hypermodern resort and commercial shopping district. Lorraine had known about the development whispers for over a year, and she had fought the idea with a quiet, terrifying ferocity. She loved that wetland. She understood its ecological value and despised the idea of turning our quiet stretch of the coast into a neon-lit tourist trap. While she was alive, she held enough legal leverage over the shared property deeds to stonewall any negotiations, but Calvin saw the Red Shoal development proposal as his ultimate crowning achievement. It was a deal worth tens of millions of dollars, a transaction that would elevate him from a wealthy local fish to a genuine regional power broker. He had been secretly meeting with Red Shoal executives for months, shaking hands in back rooms and making promises he did not legally have the authority to keep. Lorraine's death should have cleared his path. However, the structure of her estate threw a massive wrench into his grand design. Her assets, including her voting rights on the land board and her share of the property, were not left entirely to him. They were locked into the trust. If I remained an eligible beneficiary of that trust, my signature would be required to authorize the sale. I would hold the absolute power to veto the Red Shoal deal and preserve the land exactly as my mother wanted. Calvin knew I would never sign. He knew I would honor Lorraine's wishes and kill his legacy project dead in its tracks. Therefore, his objective was brutally simple. He did not just want to humiliate me, he needed to completely legally sever me from the trust. If he could prove I was in violation of the inheritance conditions, my share would default back to the estate, giving Calvin the undisputed majority control he needed to push the sale through. To achieve this, Calvin and his attorney, Arthur Vance, constructed a lawsuit designed to inflict maximum reputational damage. They did not file a standard, quiet probate petition to clarify a minor clause in a will. They filed a massive civil complaint built on the heaviest moral accusations imaginable. The filings did not just challenge my employment status, they painted a horrific picture of elder abuse. Vance drafted documents alleging that I had taken advantage of my mother's supposedly failing mental state. He claimed I used her final vulnerable months to systematically siphon funds from her private accounts. It was a monstrous accusation, deliberately engineered to trigger a visceral reaction from anyone who read it, and Calvin made absolutely certain that everyone read it. He insisted on a jury trial. In civil probate matters, bench trials decided by a single judge are the standard, Quiet wrote. But Calvin demanded 12 local citizens sit in the box and listen to him destroy my character. He turned a private family tragedy into a brutal, highly publicized arena sport. He did this because Calvin Galloway does not merely want to win. He needs to be witnessed winning. He has spent his entire life feeding on the validation of the crowd. He needed the men he played golf with, the women who attended his church, and the bankers who held his loans to watch him bravely defend his poor, deceased wife from her greedy, parasitic daughter. The sheer scale of the betrayal was suffocating. Every time I drove through town, I could feel the hostile stares of people I had known since childhood. The cashiers at the pharmacy would stop talking when I walked in. The waitresses at the diner would give me my coffee with stiff, judgmental silence. Calvin had successfully engineered an environment where I was not just a defendant in a lawsuit. I was the universally despised villain of Blackmere County. The culmination of his grand production arrived on the first morning of the trial. I parked my car 2 blocks away and walked toward the courthouse, feeling the heavy, humid air pressing down on my shoulders. The front lawn of the municipal building was swarming with people. It looked less like a legal proceeding and more like a high-profile political rally. As I approached the wide stone steps, I stopped and watched the scene unfolding near the heavy oak doors. Calvin was standing at the top of the stairs, surrounded by a tight circle of influential local businessmen and city council members. He was wearing his best navy suit, a somber tie, and an expression of brave, long-suffering determination. He was clapping the local sheriff on the back. He was gripping the hands of his neighbors, nodding gravely as they offered him their unwavering support. He was smiling. He was actively campaigning on the corpse of our family, treating the trial over his recently deceased wife exactly like a fundraising gala for his own ego. Arthur Vance dimmed the overhead lights, and the low, mechanical hum of the digital projector's cooling fan immediately filled the heavy, humid air of the courtroom. The image that flashed onto the pale plaster wall was a blown-up screenshot of a desolate, brutally minimalist website. The banner read Crown Ledger Advisory in a sterile block font. Vance walked toward the jury box holding a thick manila folder, letting the sheer emptiness of the projected image hang in the room like a bad punchline. "This is the defendant's alleged employer," Vance announced, his voice dripping with theatrical skepticism. a company that claims to handle high-level financial consulting and corporate advisory services. Yet, our private investigators spent 3 consecutive days looking for it and found no physical office. The address listed on their state registry is a commercial mail drop located inside a strip mall, wedged right between a discount dry cleaner and a vacant lot. There are no employee directories. There are no client testimonials. There is exactly zero public proof that this entity conducts any legitimate revenue-generating business anywhere in the United States. Next came the hired gun. Vance called a handwriting analyst to the stand, a man with thin wire-rimmed glasses who charged $500 an hour to tell juries exactly what the prosecution paid him to say. He boasted about his 30 years of experience before bringing out enlarged, high-resolution photographs of withdrawal slips from Lorraine's private banking accounts. The expert pointed a red laser pointer at the sweeping, delicate curves of my mother's signature. "Notice the micro-tremors here on the baseline," the expert said, tapping the screen, "and observe the highly inconsistent pen pressure on the final loop of the letter Y. While I cannot definitively state this document was traced, these specific anomalies are highly consistent with an unauthorized party attempting to mimic a degraded motor function." He did not use the word forgery because he was legally cautious. He did not have to. He used the kind of dense, academic jargon that makes a malicious assumption sound like a scientific certainty. The collective glare from the jury box told me the poison had landed perfectly. The 12 men and women looked at me as if I had physically pried the pen from my dying mother's trembling fingers. But the true architectural masterpiece of my public execution was my sister. When Piper took the stand, she did not wear her usual designer clothes. She wore a soft, faded gray cardigan over a modest, high-necked blouse. She looked exhausted, fragile, and utterly relatable. She made deliberate, soulful eye contact with the jury foreperson, a retired schoolteacher who immediately looked back at Piper as if she were a wounded bird. Piper spoke in a quiet, trembling voice about the grueling, invisible realities of hospice care. "I was there at 2 o'clock in the morning when her lungs started filling with fluid," Piper testified, gripping the edges of the wooden stand until her knuckles turned white. "I was the one measuring the liquid morphine doses. Nova was never there for the ugly parts. She would breeze into town every few months, wearing a coat that cost more than my car, and tell us she had to step outside to take a very important conference call. She treated our mother's illness like a temporary inconvenience." Vance approached her gently, playing the role of the sympathetic protector. "Did your mother ever express concerns about Nova's lifestyle during those final months?" Piper looked down at her lap, letting a single perfect tear escape and roll down her cheek. "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking perfectly on the vowel. "Mom cried to me one afternoon when the pain was really bad. She held my hand and said she just did not understand how Nova was living. She said Nova was so good at making up these grand, impressive stories about her life, but there was nothing real underneath it all. She died completely terrified for her, knowing Nova was living a lie. It was a devastatingly effective piece of fiction. It was a twisted, funhouse mirror version of the truth. My mother had worried, yes, but she worried about the crushing weight of the corporate secrets I carried and the toll my isolation took on me. She never doubted the validity of my career, but the jury did not know that. They leaned back in their heavy wooden chairs, crossing their arms, completely sold on the narrative of the shallow, predatory city girl who abandoned her family for a fake life. Calvin placed his face in his hands at the plaintiff's table, acting as though the memory was physically tearing his heart apart. Throughout the entire morning session, Calvin had successfully woven his outdated, provincial philosophy into the very fabric of the trial. His foundational argument, repeated ad nauseum by Vance, was incredibly simple. Honest work is visible work. In Blackmere County, you could point to a fleet of commercial fishing boats. You could point to a lumber yard. You could point to a busy storefront. You could not point to a post office box and claim success. Calvin weaponized the local nostalgia and the blue-collar pride of the jury against the invisible nature of my profession. He made his own profound ignorance sound like a deeply held traditional virtue. If a person did not have a brass nameplate on a door, their wealth was inherently suspicious. I sat at the defense table and did absolutely nothing. I did not write furious, defensive notes to my attorney, Julian Cross. I did not shake my head in disgust or roll my eyes. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap and my expression entirely neutral. The gallery behind me murmured constantly, taking my silence as a definitive sign of a cornered, defeated animal. They thought I had no defense because I was not fighting back. They did not understand that Julian and I were simply letting Vance build his house of cards as high and as confidently as possible before we kicked the table out from under him. But while the gallery completely misread my stillness, Judge Miriam Weller did not. Toward the end of the afternoon session, Vance attempted to formally introduce the lease agreement for the commercial mailbox as hard evidence of a fraudulent corporate structure. Judge Weller held up a single, pale hand. The entire room went dead silent. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the paper. "Counselor," Judge Weller said, her voice dry, sharp, and rasping, echoing off the high mahogany walls. "Look at page 4 of this lease agreement. Section 9, paragraph 2. Does this document contain a standard commercial liability waiver, or does it specifically reference a federal Tier 3 non-disclosure mandate for secure communications?" Vance blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off balance by the microscopic, seemingly irrelevant detail. He fumbled with his own copy of the lease, his face flushing slightly. "It appears to be a fully redacted clause, Your Honor. The leasing agency cited standard privacy protocols." Judge Weller stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, her eyes betraying absolutely nothing. "I see," she replied softly. "Proceed." She did not strike the evidence from the record. She did not admonish Vance or save me from the accusation. But she was actively hunting for the structural markers of a ghost agency, and she had just found a massive one. Vance, desperate to regain his momentum and shake off the judge's strange interruption, moved in for the final brutal strike of the day. He walked back to his table and picked up a massive, black-bound binder containing hundreds of pages of raw banking data. It was the exact moment I had been waiting for, the moment Calvin truly believed would lock me in a cage forever. "Your Honor," Vance said, turning to face the jury with a look of triumphant, righteous disgust. "We have spent all day discussing the massive amounts of money that went missing from Lorraine Galloway's private accounts, but we have not yet discussed where that money went. We have subpoenaed the financial records, and we have uncovered a massive, complex web of wire transfers routed through anonymous intermediary holding companies." Vance walked right up to the wooden railing that separated us and pointed his expensive pen directly at my face. "We are asking the court to admit this financial ledger into evidence. It contains every single dollar the defendant siphoned from her mother's estate and funneled into untraceable corporate entities. We intend to use the very money she hid to prove a definitive, multi-year pattern of systemic embezzlement." He was holding the exact records of the private nurses I had paid for. He was holding the receipts for the experimental respiratory treatments I had funded. He was holding the evidence of the shell accounts I used to keep my mother breathing for an extra 18 months. And Arthur Vance, acting on the direct orders of my father, was about to submit my silent, agonizing sacrifice as the ultimate, undeniable proof of my guilt. Julian Cross is not a man who operates in the theater of volume. While Arthur Vance treated the courtroom like a stage for his own personal grievances, pacing and shouting to the back rows, my attorney barely moved. Julian wore a charcoal suit that was well-tailored but entirely unremarkable. He did not wave documents in the air. He did not object to every minor slight. He possessed a terrifying absolute stillness. He understood the fundamental rule of a legal trap. You have to let the prey walk far enough inside before you pull the heavy iron lever. For the first 2 days of the trial, Julian let my father and my sister talk. He let them build their fortress of lies with absolute certainty. He allowed them to dig their roots so deeply into their fabricated narrative that any attempt to pull back later would snap their credibility in half. When Vance finally called me to the witness stand, the gallery leaned forward, vibrating with anticipation. They wanted to see the arrogant city girl crumble. Vance approached the podium, resting his hands on the edges. "Miss Galloway, you claim to be employed. Could you please tell the jury exactly what your daily duties entail? And please, try to be specific." I looked directly at him, keeping my breathing perfectly even. "I am a compliance and restructuring consultant," I said. "I execute specialized advisory mandates for entities undergoing severe financial transitions." Vance smirked, looking back at the jury. "That is a very impressive arrangement of syllables. What does it actually mean? Do you sit at a desk? Do you answer a telephone? Where is your office?" "My professional responsibilities require continuous, active oversight," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I am bound by strict, legally enforceable non-disclosure agreements that prohibit me from maintaining a standard public profile or discussing the operational details of my clients." A sharp barking laugh erupted from the plaintiff's table. Calvin was leaning back in his chair, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "It is just flowery talk for a vagrant," Calvin declared loudly, completely ignoring the basic rules of the courtroom. "She has absolutely nothing. She is making it up as she goes to sound important." Judge Weller turned her head slowly, fixing her gaze on my father. "Mr. Galloway, if you speak out of turn in my courtroom one more time, you will be escorted out by the bailiffs. Do you understand me?" Calvin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he nodded, leaning over to whisper something to Vance. He was radiating smugness. To him, my precise, carefully worded answers sounded like the desperate deflections of a con artist caught in a corner. He genuinely believed his sheer arrogance was winning the room. He did not realize that every opaque sentence I delivered was laying the groundwork for the moment his case would collapse. I was not hiding. I was letting him walk straight into it. When it was Julian's turn to cross-examine my family, the atmosphere shifted. He did not attack with anger. He simply began tugging gently at the loose threads Vance had so carelessly left hanging. He started with Piper. When my sister took the stand again, she looked confident. Bolstered by her earlier performance of the grieving saint, Julian walked up to the podium holding a single piece of paper. "Miss Galloway," Julian began, his tone polite and distinctly conversational, "you testified earlier that you were the primary caregiver and that you managed your mother's daily affairs." "Yes," Piper said, lifting her chin. "I was there every single day. And as part of managing her affairs, you were intimately familiar with her financial ledgers? The ones your counsel just submitted as evidence of fraud?" Piper hesitated for just a second. "We discuss the finances constantly. My father and I—" Julian adjusted his glasses. "I did not ask if you discussed them. I asked if you personally handled them. Did you ever possess the original, physical ledger books? Did you provide the signature sample to the handwriting expert? Did you personally reconcile the banking statements at the end of every month?" "My father took care of the heavy paperwork," Piper stammered, her hands gripping the edge of the witness box tighter. But I knew what was going on. "He told me everything." "Ah," Julian said softly, stepping back so the jury could fully absorb the admission. "So you did not directly oversee the finances. You simply repeated the narrative your father provided to you. You are not testifying to what you saw, Miss Galloway. You are testifying to what you were told." Vance shot up from his chair. "Objection, Your Honor." Counsel is badgering the witness. In a normal trial in Blackmere County, the permanent local judge would have sustained that objection immediately to protect Calvin's youngest daughter from embarrassment. But Judge Weller did not even look at Vance. "Overruled," she stated flatly. The witness's direct knowledge of the financial documents is highly relevant to her previous testimony. The jury will note the distinction. Piper's face flushed a deep crimson. The illusion of the highly capable, perfectly informed caregiver had just sustained its first major fracture. Julian then pivoted to the most dangerous aspect of their case: my mother's mental state. He called Calvin back to the stand. Julian produced a large timeline board, displaying it clearly for the jury box. Mr. Galloway, Julian said, pacing slowly in front of the board. You claim your wife was suffering from severe cognitive decline during the final 18 months of her life. You claim this is how my client was able to manipulate her into signing away massive amounts of money. She was not in her right mind, Calvin insisted, gripping the wooden rail and putting on his sad, weary face. It broke my heart to see it, but she was terribly confused. She did not know what she was doing. I see, Julian said. Let us look at the timeline. According to the medical records subpoenaed by your own counsel, Lorraine's primary physician noted she was completely lucid and entirely capable of making her own decisions up until her final 3 weeks. Yet, you began telling your neighbors and business associates that she was mentally compromised exactly 14 months prior to her death. Julian tapped a specific date marked in bright red ink on the board. Can you tell the court what else happened during this exact month? Because according to the County Land Board meeting minutes, this was the exact same month your wife formally registered her legal opposition to the Red Shoal Development Project, a massive commercial project that you heavily favored. The courtroom went dead silent. The jury foreperson leaned forward, her eyes darting between the date on the board and my father's suddenly rigid posture. Objection! Vance shouted, his face turning an angry shade of purple. Relevance! This is a private probate dispute, not a commercial zoning hearing. Your Honor, Julian countered smoothly, his voice never rising above a calm baritone. The plaintiff has accused my client of exploiting a mentally incapacitated woman. Establishing exactly who first fabricated the narrative of that incapacitation and their massive financial motive for doing so goes directly to the heart of this perjury. Judge Weller steepled her fingers, her dark, unreadable eyes locking onto Calvin, who was suddenly sweating under the collar of his expensive suit. I will allow it, Judge Weller said, her voice cutting through the heavy tension like a serrated blade. And Mr. Vance, I strongly suggest you allow the defense to complete their line of questioning before you interrupt my courtroom again. Calvin swallowed hard. He looked at the local gallery for support, but the friendly, blindly approving faces were now marked with genuine confusion and dawning suspicion. He realized, perhaps for the very first time in his life, that he was standing on a stage he did not completely control. Julian did not wait for Calvin to stammer out a pathetic defense. He walked back to our defense table and picked up a thick, heavy manila envelope. He turned to face the bench, his demeanor shifting from conversational to intensely formal. Your Honor, Julian announced, his voice carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality. The plaintiff has spent the last 3 days building a case on the sheer presumption that my client's professional life is a fraudulent fiction. They have heavily implied criminal embezzlement without formally charging it, using the veil of a civil suit to bypass the necessary burden of proof. Julian held the envelope up so the entire room could see it. If opposing counsel insists on maintaining this implicit criminal accusation regarding my client's employment status and financial resources, the defense will no longer rely on verbal testimony to refute it. I am formally notifying the court that we will file an emergency motion to submit verified, federally sealed documentation regarding Nova Galloway's professional credentials and active operational mandates for an in-camera review. The memory of my mother does not live in the grand, sweeping gestures that my father so desperately craved. It lives in the quiet, stolen spaces between his loud proclamations. During my years building a life in the shadows of corporate crisis management, Lorraine and I maintained a lifeline built on brevity. She would call me on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock. Knowing Calvin would be down at the marina shouting at the dockhands, she never interrogated me about my employers. She never asked for the names of the board members I was unseating or the hedge funds I was dismantling. Instead, she would listen to the exhaustion in my voice, the tight cadence of someone who had been awake for 48 hours straight, and she would ask one very specific question. You are still carrying other people's burdens, aren't you? She knew. She could not see the spreadsheets or the federal injunctions, but she recognized the weight of consequence. One afternoon, During a particularly brutal winter when Calvin had spent the entire Thanksgiving dinner mocking my supposed lack of a career path to our extended family, Lorraine walked me out to my car. She wrapped her heavy wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, the freezing wind whipping her hair across her face, and she looked at me with an intensity that could shatter glass. "Your father only believes in what he can show off to other people," she told me, her voice cutting through the bitter cold. "So never let him be the one to define your value. He measures the ocean by the size of his own bucket." That was the woman my father was currently trying to paint as a helpless, confused victim of dementia. He had spent days convincing the jury that she was a fragile bird, manipulated by a predatory daughter. Julian Cross stood up from the defense table. The courtroom had grown thick and restless after the bombshell of my federally sealed documentation, but Julian did not press the federal angle just yet. He knew that to truly dismantle Calvin Galloway in a town like Blackmere, he could not just use city laws, he had to use local reality. "The defense calls Mara Bell," Julian announced quietly. The murmurs in the gallery spiked immediately. Calvin shifted violently in his chair, his jaw clenching so hard I could see the muscle twitching under his skin. Mara Bell was not a high-powered consultant or a medical expert imported from a coastal city. She was a 72-year-old woman who had lived in Blackmere County her entire life. She wore a sensible gray skirt suit, thick orthopedic shoes, and a pair of reading glasses suspended around her neck by a silver chain. She had been the independent bookkeeper for several local businesses, but more importantly, she had been Lorraine's personal accountant for 3 decades. Mara walked to the witness stand with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who had zero interest in anyone's theatrics. She swore the oath, sat down, and folded her hands in her lap. Julian approached the podium. "Mrs. Bell, you managed Lorraine Galloway's personal taxes and private accounts separate from the family marina. Is that correct?" "Yes, I did," Mara replied, her voice raspy but entirely steady. Lorraine liked to keep her own affairs in order. She never fully trusted Calvin's bookkeeping. He tended to mix personal ambition with operational budgets, and she preferred clean ledgers. A few people in the gallery actually gasped. In our town, openly criticizing Calvin's business acumen was practically a local crime. Opposing counsel has spent the last week asserting that Lorraine Galloway's judgment was materially impaired during the final 18 months of her life. Julian said, "In your professional capacity, how would you describe her mental state during that exact time frame?" Mara adjusted her glasses and looked directly at the jury box. She was sharper than a tack. Right up until her final 3 weeks, 8 months before she passed, she found a calculation error in a municipal property tax assessment that the county auditor had missed. She marched down to the tax office and forced them to correct it. That is not the behavior of a woman who does not know what day it is. She was entirely lucid. Julian nodded slowly, letting the jury absorb the image of Lorraine outsmarting the county auditor. "Mrs. Bell, did Lorraine ever express concerns to you regarding her husband's access to her financial documents?" "She did," Mara stated flatly. "When she received her final prognosis, she asked me to help her set up a secure, off-site storage solution. She rented a private safety deposit box at a regional bank 2 counties over. She explicitly instructed me that Calvin was not to know it existed. She said he would try to rewrite her life the moment she could no longer speak for herself." Calvin leaned forward, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of red. He looked at Arthur Vance, silently demanding that the lawyer object, but Vance knew better. Objecting to a beloved local senior citizen recounting a dead woman's exact instructions would be procedural suicide. Julian walked back to his table and retrieved a stack of freshly printed financial logs. "Mrs. Bell, you have reviewed the contents of that off-site lockbox, and you have cross-referenced them with the banking records the plaintiff has submitted as evidence of embezzlement. What exactly did you find?" "I found the other half of the story," Mara said, her tone laced with absolute authority. "The plaintiff showed you the withdrawals. They showed you thousands of dollars leaving Lorraine's account. What they deliberately failed to show you were the invoices inside that lockbox. Julian handed copies of the documents to the bailiff, who distributed them to the jury and the judge. Every single withdrawal that the plaintiff labeled as highly suspicious matches perfectly with an incoming invoice, Mara explained, pointing a weathered finger at the papers. On the 14th of May, $20,000 was withdrawn. Inside the lockbox is a stamped receipt from the private oncology clinic for exactly $20,000, dated the 16th of May. The money was not stolen. It was a revolving cash flow. The funds were withdrawn, routed securely to protect the privacy of the payer, and then applied directly to Lorraine's life-sustaining care. The ledgers are immaculately clean. The entire foundation of the embezzlement charge crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. The jury looked at the receipts, then looked up at Calvin. The local sympathy that had insulated him for days began to evaporate, replaced by the cold realization that he had deliberately presented them with a distorted version of the truth. But Julian was not finished. He stepped closer to the witness stand. "Mrs. Bell, was there anything else of note inside that lockbox?" Mara reached into her own handbag, a worn leather tote she had brought to the stand with her. She pulled out a small, rectangular plastic device. It was a digital audio recorder. Lorraine knew the paper trail might not be enough. She knew her husband's talent for twisting the truth. She recorded this 4 months before she died. Julian formally requested to admit the audio file into evidence. Judge Weller, who had been watching Mara with a look of profound respect, nodded her immediate approval. The court clerk connected the device to the room's speaker system. A sharp hiss of static filled the silent courtroom, followed by the sound of a heavy breath. Then, my mother's voice echoed off the high ceiling. It was weak, strained by illness, but it carried an undeniable, fierce clarity. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of her wash over me. "I am recording this of my own free will," Lorraine's voice announced. "I know my husband. I know what he will do when I'm gone. He will try to punish Nova. He will try to tell the world she is nothing. But he is blind. Nova is not allowed to explain her work like other people. Her life requires a silence that small men will never comprehend, and anyone who uses that silence to humiliate her is only confessing they understand absolutely nothing about my daughter. I see her. I know exactly what she is, and she has my absolute blessing." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and thoroughly devastating. It was a voice from the grave reaching out to slap Calvin Galloway across the face in front of the entire county. While the tape alone did not instantly resolve the complex legal mechanics of the trust dispute, it completely annihilated the moral high ground Calvin had so carefully constructed. The thick layer of righteous paint he had plastered over his greed was gone, revealing the rotting wood underneath. I opened my eyes and looked at the gallery. Then, I looked at Piper. My sister was staring blankly ahead, her mouth slightly open. The performance was gone. The tearful, brave caregiver routine had vanished. For the very first time in her pampered, insulated life, Piper realized that her mother had seen right through the family charade. Lorraine had not believed the lies Calvin fed to Piper. Lorraine had not been the helpless victim Piper claimed to be protecting. Piper was suddenly, violently aware that she was standing on the wrong side of history, and the ground was giving way beneath her feet. Calvin was breathing heavily, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. He glared at Julian, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred radiating from his eyes. He thought the assault was over. He thought the audio tape was the absolute worst thing we could throw at him. Julian waited until the echoes of my mother's voice had fully settled into the bones of the courtroom. Then, he looked at Mara Bell one last time. "Mrs. Bell," Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "According to the master inventory log of the lockbox, there was one final item secured within it. Can you please tell the court what that item is?" Mara reached into her leather bag again. Her hands were perfectly steady. She pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope made of heavy, cream-colored parchment. It was sealed with dark red wax. Lorraine gave me very specific instructions regarding this envelope, Mara said, holding it up by the edges. She made me swear on my own life that I would only bring it into a courtroom under one specific condition. And what was that condition? Julian asked. Mara turned her head, looking past my father, past my sister, and locking her eyes directly onto mine. She told me this envelope was only to be opened if Nova was forced to prove she exists. The emotional resonance of my mother's voice was still hanging in the humid air when Julian Cross completely changed the battlefield. He did not give Calvin a moment to recover or spin a new lie. Julian pivoted away from the realm of family drama and stepped directly into the cold, unforgiving machinery of forensic accounting. This was no longer a dispute over hurt feelings. It was a hunt. He recalled the handwriting expert to the stand. The man who had been so smug and authoritative on Tuesday now looked distinctly uncomfortable as Julian approached him. My attorney was holding the original, physical withdrawal slips we had pulled from the lockbox. Sir, when you testified that the signatures on the estate transfers showed signs of fraudulent manipulation, what exact materials were you examining? Julian asked, holding up the crisp, original papers. I was provided with high-resolution digital scans by Mr. Vance, the expert replied, shifting his weight nervously in the wooden chair. Scans, Julian repeated the word, letting it hang in the air like an indictment. You never examined the physical indentations on the original paper. You never established a verified chain of custody. Furthermore, let us look at the control samples you used to establish Lorraine Galloway's baseline signature. Julian placed a thick medical log on the digital projector. The plaintiff provided you with 3 control signatures. Julian continued. Did you bother to cross-reference the dates of those signatures with her medical charts? Because if you had, you would have seen that all 3 control samples were taken during the exact 2-week period she was placed on a massive, highly aggressive regimen of intravenous narcotics. You did not compare a suspected forgery to a healthy signature. You were handed a heavily medicated, physically impaired signature and told to use it as the definitive standard of truth. The expert swallowed hard. He looked over at Arthur Vance, but Vance was furiously flipping through his own legal pads, realizing the trap had just snapped shut. I can only evaluate the materials provided to me by the retaining counsel, the expert muttered. The jury visibly recoiled. The illusion of scientific certainty was dead. The samples had been deliberately cherry-picked by my father's team to manufacture a crime that never happened. Julian dismissed the expert without another word and moved immediately to the financial ledgers. He replaced the medical charts on the projector with a massive, color-coded spreadsheet. The atmosphere in the courtroom tightened, transforming into the taut, electric silence of a procedural thriller. The net was drawing closed. The plaintiff has accused my client of bleeding the estate dry, Julian said, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. Let us track the blood. On the 1st of September, $85,000 was withdrawn from the primary trust. Opposing counsel called this theft. However, look at the corresponding entry on the right side of the board. Julian tapped the glowing screen with his pen. Exactly 48 hours later, $85,000 was deposited into the operating account of the private nursing agency that provided round-the-clock care for Lorraine. On the 15th of November, $40,000 was withdrawn. 3 days later, $40,000 was paid directly to a specialized respiratory clinic in the city. The money did not vanish into Nova Galloway's pockets. It circled back, dollar for dollar, to keep Lorraine Galloway breathing and to maintain the household. The numbers were irrefutable. They locked together perfectly. I watched the jury foreperson taking frantic notes, crossing out whatever lies Vance had sold her previously. But there is a discrepancy, Julian said softly. The sudden drop in his volume made the entire room lean forward. There is one series of transfers that does not match the medical billing. He pulled up a new slide. 3 months before Lorraine passed, a sum of $120,000 was suddenly wired out of the medical reserve fund. It did not go to a hospital. It went to an intermediary holding company called Apex Solutions, My team pulled the state corporate registry for this entity. Julian slapped a certified government document onto the projector glass. Apex Solutions is a registered subsidiary of Red Shoal Development. This is the exact corporate conglomerate that was actively lobbying to pave over the Galloway family marshlands. This is the exact commercial deal Lorraine Galloway was legally trying to block. This money, drained from a dying woman's medical reserve, was used to pay for unauthorized ecological surveys and preliminary zoning fees to push that land sale forward. Julian turned slowly and locked eyes with my father. Someone was indeed siphoning money from a vulnerable woman to fund their own personal ambitions, Julian said, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. But it was not my client, Calvin Galloway snapped. Years of unchallenged authority, decades of demanding blind obedience from the town, completely short-circuited in the face of absolute public exposure. "Those surveys were an investment," Calvin roared, slamming his heavy fist down on the plaintiff's table and jumping to his feet. "That land is a gold mine, and she was sitting on it out of pure, irrational stubbornness. The accounts were a complete mess anyway. Someone had to take the initiative to secure the future of our family." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and shocked whispers. Arthur Vance practically tackled his own client, grabbing Calvin by the arm and trying to pull him back into his chair, but the damage was utterly catastrophic. Julian simply stood there, perfectly calm. "Mr. Galloway," Julian said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "You testified under oath on Monday that you had absolutely zero access to, and zero knowledge of, the internal workings of that specific medical reserve account. Yet you just screamed in front of this jury that you personally directed funds out of it to pay for your commercial land surveys." Calvin froze. The aggressive, righteous anger drained from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving him looking pale, hollow, and terribly old. He realized what he had done. He had just confessed to the exact financial manipulation he had spent the entire week pinning on me. He knew too much about the accounts he swore he never touched. Judge Weller brought her wooden gavel down. The sharp, violent crack echoed through the room, instantly silencing the murmurs. She was leaning far over the bench, her pen flying across her legal pad with aggressive speed. Her demeanor had shifted from observant neutrality to a rigid, imposing judicial fury. "I will be taking a brief recess to review these financial appendices in my chambers," Judge Weller announced, her voice dangerously tight. Before she could stand up, Julian stepped forward. He picked up the heavy wax-sealed envelope that Mara Bell had delivered to the court. "Your Honor, before we recess, I have one final motion," Julian said. "The plaintiff initiated this lawsuit to invalidate my client's inheritance based on the explicit accusation that she is a fraud, a vagrant, and fundamentally incapable of proving legitimate employment. They have turned a civil probate matter into a vicious campaign of public character assassination, based entirely on an assumption." Julian held the envelope high so the entire room could see the official seals. "I am formally requesting that the court admit the contents of this envelope for an in-camera review. These documents contain classified, federally sealed mandates. They will establish my client's professional standing, confirm her exemption under the trust, and undercut the plaintiff's entire argument." Calvin, desperate to regain some microscopic shred of his shattered dignity, let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He adjusted his silk tie, trying to project the image of the untouchable patriarch one last time before his audience. "It is a bluff," Calvin said loudly, sneering at the gallery to ensure his loyalists heard him. "It is just more of her ridiculous city smoke and mirrors. A person with a real, honest job never needs a court to look at their life in secret." Judge Weller stopped gathering her files. She slowly lowered her hands to the polished wood of the bench. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the visiting judge turned her head and looked directly at Calvin Galloway for the very first time since the trial began. The silence stretched out, heavy, thick, and suffocating. "Mr. Galloway," Judge Weller said, speaking so slowly and with such profound, chilling authority that every single syllable felt like a physical blow. "You should be extremely careful with that assumption. The recess was called for 30 minutes, but the suffocating heat inside the Blackmere County Courthouse did not dissipate. It gathered in the corners of the heavy architecture, pressing down on everyone who filed out into the marble corridors. The gallery attendees spilled into the hallway, whispering furiously about the missing medical funds and the sudden revelation of the land development payouts. Calvin Galloway pushed through the heavy oak doors, his face a mask of tight, calculated composure. He truly believed he still held the upper hand. In his mind, the dramatic introduction of a sealed envelope was nothing more than my final, pathetic attempt at a bluff. He thought I was a cornered animal trying to use the illusion of a secret mandate to scare him away from the inheritance. I stood alone at the far end of the corridor, looking out a tall, arched window that framed the distant gray line of the Atlantic Ocean. The air was thick with the scent of old floor wax and nervous sweat. I heard the sharp, arrogant click of my father's leather shoes approaching before he even spoke. "You really think a prop envelope is going to save you from a jury of your peers?" Calvin asked, his voice low and dripping with condescension. I did not turn to look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon. "There are no props today." "Calvin," he stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he had done when I was a teenager. But I did not flinch. "I am going to offer you a way out of this," he said, his tone shifting into the smooth, patronizing cadence of a small-town politician offering a backroom deal. "Because despite everything you have done to humiliate this family, I am still a reasonable man. Tell your lawyer to withdraw that ridiculous sealed document. Sign over your voting rights to the wetland property, and we can draft a joint statement for the court. We will tell the judge there was simply a paperwork misunderstanding regarding your mother's accounts. You walk away with a small, quiet settlement, and you never come back here again." He wanted the land. He wanted the Red Shoal development money so desperately that he was willing to erase the massive public spectacle of a trial just to secure his signature on the deed. I finally turned to face him. I looked at the deep lines around his mouth, the desperate, greedy light in his eyes, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the cold, clinical detachment I used when dismantling a corrupt corporate board. "No," I said quietly. Calvin blinked, clearly caught off guard by the total absence of hesitation in my voice. "Excuse me?" I said no. I am not signing anything. I am not giving you the land. And I am certainly not participating in your fabricated narrative of a paperwork misunderstanding. We are going to finish exactly what you started." The facade cracked. The reasonable patriarch vanished, replaced by the cornered, furious tyrant. Calvin's face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. He leaned in, his breath hot and ragged against my face. "You arrogant, ungrateful little wretch," he spat, his voice trembling with raw fury. "You think you have won because you found a few medical receipts? That land belongs to me. I built this family. I secured that deal." And Lorraine knew exactly what the stakes were. She was completely lucid enough to sign those development papers that day. She just wanted to spite me. She knew exactly what she was doing. The words hung in the air, echoing sharply against the marble walls. A sudden, sharp clatter broke the tension. I looked past Calvin's shoulder. Standing less than 10 feet away, near the brass water fountain, was my sister. Piper had dropped her leather purse on the hard floor. The contents were spilling out, but she did not look down. Her wide, terrified eyes were locked entirely on our father. Calvin froze. He slowly turned his head and saw Piper standing there. The silence that followed was heavy and final. Piper was not a financial genius, but she was not deaf. She had spent the entire week sitting in a courtroom, weeping into a tissue while Calvin explicitly swore under oath that our mother was suffering from severe cognitive decline and lacked the mental capacity to make any decisions. Yet, here in the hallway, fueled by blind rage over a real estate deal, he had just screamed that she was completely lucid and fully aware of her actions. In a single, reckless outburst, Calvin had shattered the illusion he had built for his favorite child. Piper finally understood the horrifying truth. Her father was perfectly willing to use her mother's terminal illness as a sword in front of a jury. and her mother's lucidity as a shield in a private hallway, adapting the narrative to whatever secured him the most power in any given second. Calvin opened his mouth to speak, to spin a new web, but Piper took a sudden, staggering step backward. She shook her head, her face pale and drawn, and she turned and walked away without saying a single word. The loyal soldier had just realized she was fighting for the wrong army. At that exact moment, the heavy brass doors of the courthouse entrance swung open. A man wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored dark suit stepped inside. He bypassed the security checkpoint with a flash of a specialized federal credential. He carried a highly secure, locked briefcase handcuffed to his left wrist. He scanned the hallway, locked eyes with Julian Cross, and walked straight toward him. Julian met the man halfway. The courier unlocked the briefcase, retrieved a thick, heavy dossier bound with reinforced tamper-evident tape, and handed it over. Julian signed a digital pad, and the courier turned and left the building as silently as he had arrived. The dossier was stamped with the unmistakable, eagle-crested seal of the Continental Receivership Authority. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom doors, announcing that court was back in session. It had only been 15 minutes. Judge Miriam Weller had returned to the bench significantly faster than anyone anticipated. She had not spent the recess agonizing over complex legal theory or consulting local case law. She had returned quickly because she was not checking facts. She was preparing for an execution. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had mutated. The suffocating heat remained, but the restless, gossiping energy of the local gallery was gone. It had been replaced by a dense, heavy dread. The townspeople could feel the atmospheric pressure dropping. This was no longer a messy family dispute over a deceased mother's savings. Something massive, something possessing an incredible, destructive gravity, was about to be unleashed in the center of the room. The jury filed back into the box. They looked rigid, their eyes darting between Julian's new dossier and Calvin's pale, sweating face. Arthur Vance stood at the plaintiff's table. The expensive lawyer was visibly trembling. He kept adjusting his tie, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped his pen twice. He did not understand why the visiting judge had suddenly radiated such an overwhelming aura of authority, but his survival instincts were finally screaming at him that he had led his client into a fatal ambush. I took my seat next to Julian. I looked over my shoulder and found Piper in the gallery. For the first time in my entire life, the look in my sister's eyes was not one of smug superiority or manufactured pity. It was raw, unadulterated terror. She was staring at the thick sealed dossier sitting on Julian's desk. She looked at me, and I saw the horrifying realization wash over her. Piper finally understood that they had spent the last 2 years weaving an elaborate, malicious fiction, and they had arrogantly chosen to spin it in front of the one person who actually held the power to destroy them. Julian stood up. He picked up the envelope Mara Bell had delivered, alongside the freshly arrived federal dossier, and walked them directly up to the bench. He handed them to the bailiff, who passed them up to Judge Weller. "Your Honor," Julian said, his voice echoing in the dead, silent room, "we submit these documents for your immediate review." Judge Weller did not look at Arthur Vance. She did not look at Calvin. She picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the heavy red wax seal of my mother's envelope first. She read the single page inside, her face betraying nothing. Then, she turned her attention to the thick federal dossier. She broke the tamper-evident tape. She pulled out the heavy watermarked parchment that contained my official, classified appointment orders. The courtroom held its breath. The only sound was the sharp, crisp rustle of paper as the judge turned the page. Judge Weller's eyes scanned the complex legal jargon, the federal authorization codes, and the highest-level security clearances required to operate within the Continental Receivership Authority. Her eyes reached the bottom of the page, where the name of the appointed crisis director was printed in bold, black ink. She stopped reading. Judge Weller slowly lowered the document. She took off her reading glasses and placed them deliberately onto the polished wood of her desk. She lifted her head and looked past the lawyers, past the jury, and past my father. She looked directly into my eyes. It was not a look of surprise. It was the deep, calculating gaze of a veteran commander recognizing a phantom operative she had only ever known on paper. It was the look of a woman who had spent years signing blind, sealed orders for massive corporate liquidations, only to finally see the face of the ghost who executed them. Judge Weller had just confirmed a suspicion she had harbored since the moment she read the name of my shell company on the very first day of the trial. Judge Miriam Weller did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When she finally broke the heavy, suffocating silence of the courtroom, her words carried the terrifying, undeniable weight of an executioner's axe falling cleanly onto a wooden block. "Mr. Vance," Judge Weller began, her dark eyes locking onto the trembling lawyer, "you and your client have spent the better part of a week building a highly theatrical narrative. You have stood before this court and mocked the entity known as Crown Ledger Advisory. You called it a phantom. You called it a cheap shell designed to harbor a vagrant." She picked up the classified federal dossier, holding the thick parchment between her fingers. "I am not a municipal magistrate by trade," Judge Weller stated, her voice echoing off the high mahogany walls. "Before I semi-retired and agreed to take on visiting state dockets, I sat on the federal appellate bench for 15 years. During my tenure, I oversaw the highest level of corporate receivership. When catastrophic financial crimes occurred, I was the one who signed the sealed orders appointing specialized crisis directors to secure the bleeding assets." Calvin Galloway's face went entirely slack. The arrogant sneer he had worn for days dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "Crown Ledger Advisory is not a cheap front," Judge Weller continued, her tone dropping into a glacial chill. "It is a legally sanctioned, federally protected identifier used exclusively for operatives handling court-ordered, highly classified restructuring mandates. I know this because 5 years ago, I personally signed the emergency injunctions placing Nova Galloway in charge of liquidating a corrupt, multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. I gave her that clearance because she possesses a level of professional integrity and tactical brilliance that this court rarely sees." The gallery behind me erupted into chaotic, breathless whispers. The local townspeople, who had spent the last week treating my father like a grieving martyr, suddenly realized they had been manipulated into cheering for a fraud. Judge Weller slammed her wooden gavel down, instantly silencing the room. "Furthermore," she said, turning her piercing gaze directly onto Calvin, "the trust established by the late Lorraine Galloway contains a highly specific clause protecting any beneficiary engaged in professional services recognized by a competent authority. Miss Galloway's employment is legitimate, and it exists within a level of federal classification you are not cleared to question. This lawsuit rests on an assumption you were never in a position to make." Arthur Vance opened his mouth, desperately trying to salvage his career, but Judge Weller cut him off before he could form a single syllable. "Do not speak, counselor. I am not finished. You brought documents into my courtroom lacking a verified chain of custody. You brought a handwriting expert who evaluated manipulated, medically compromised samples. The financial ledgers clearly show that the funds labeled as stolen were routed directly into medical care and property maintenance for the deceased. The only financial anomalies present in these records point directly to the plaintiff using his wife's illness as a smokescreen to fund unauthorized ecological surveys for the Red Shoal Development Project." A sharp, hysterical sob ripped through the courtroom. Everyone turned. Piper Galloway was standing up in the second row of the gallery. Her hands were clutching the wooden pew in front of her so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. But there was no acting left in her eyes. It was the raw, devastating panic of a woman whose entire reality had just collapsed. "He told me to say it," Piper cried out, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at our father. "He told me over and over that if Nova was just cut out of the trust, everything would be clean. He said she did not deserve the land. He promised me Mom was too sick to know what she was doing, and I believed him. I just repeated what he told me." "Piper, sit down and shut your mouth," Calvin roared, losing the last microscopic shred of his control. "Bailiffs," Judge Weller barked, standing up from her chair. "Restrain the plaintiff. Two heavy-set county deputies immediately stepped forward, placing their hands firmly on Calvin's shoulders and forcing him back into his chair. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. His kingdom was burning to the ground in front of a live audience. Judge Weller adjusted her robes, her expression radiating absolute disgust. This court finds the plaintiff's claims to be entirely baseless, malicious, and fundamentally fraudulent, Judge Weller announced. The petition to remove Nova Galloway from the family trust is dismissed with extreme prejudice. I am assessing all court costs and the defense's legal fees directly to the plaintiff. Furthermore, I am formally referring this entire transcript to the state prosecutor's office for a comprehensive investigation into perjury, evidence tampering, and attempted estate fraud. She struck the gavel one final, echoing time. Court is adjourned. The room descended into pure chaos. Reporters from the local paper were scrambling out the doors. The townspeople were staring at Calvin like he was a diseased animal. Arthur Vance was furiously packing his briefcase, refusing to even look at his own client. Julian Cross closed his file folder, offered me a single, respectful nod, and stepped away to speak with the court clerk. I stood up from the defense table. I did not rush for the exit. I walked slowly, deliberately, across the polished wooden floor until I was standing directly in front of the plaintiff's table. Calvin looked up at me. He looked small, the booming, intimidating patriarch who had cast a massive shadow over my entire childhood was gone. In his place was just a desperate, ruined old man clutching at the ashes of his reputation. "You really think you won?" Calvin hissed, his voice trembling with a pathetic, venomous spite. "You destroyed this family. You humiliated us." I looked down at him and felt a hard, controlled cold settle through me. I did not raise my voice. I wanted him to hear every word clearly. "I did not destroy anything, Calvin. I am the only reason you even had a family left to humiliate," I said quietly. He narrowed his eyes, confused by my calmness. 7 years ago, when the hurricane wiped out the docks, the bank was exactly 3 weeks away from taking your marina. I told him, watching the arrogant confusion slowly morph into dawning dread. "That miracle commercial bridge loan you bragged about to the whole town? The one with the 3% interest rate? That was a shell corporation I built. I funded it with my own performance bonuses. I saved your business." Calvin stopped breathing, the color completely drained from his face. 3 years ago, I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity, when Piper ran her into the ground and the foreclosure notices hit, that boutique private equity firm that bailed her out, I was the primary capital partner. I bought her debt so she could keep her pride. Piper, who had crept closer to the railing, let out a tiny, suffocated gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands, staring at me as if she were looking at a ghost. "And those private nurses," I said, leaning just an inch closer to Calvin. "The experimental respiratory therapies that cost $10,000 a dose? The treatments you refused to pay for because you wanted to save your precious development land? The anonymous charity that funded all of it was me. I routed the money through intermediary trusts. I paid for every single breath my mother took while you were busy trying to sell the dirt out from under her." Calvin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands were shaking violently on the table. The ultimate, crushing weight of his reality had finally crushed him. The daughter he had spent 15 years calling a parasite, a failure, and a thief was the exact same person who had secretly financed his entire existence. He had survived entirely on my charity, and he had thanked me by trying to destroy my life. "I kept your world standing upright while you told this entire town I was a burden," I whispered. "But the charity ends today." I did not wait for a response. I did not need an apology, and I certainly did not want a reconciliation. I turned my back on Calvin Galloway and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The crowd parted for me in absolute silence. I walked out the heavy brass doors and stepped into the bright, blinding sunlight of Blackmere County. I breathed in the thick, salty air coming off the marshlands. I retained my voting rights over the trust. The Red Shoal development deal was officially dead, and the wetlands would remain exactly as my mother had always wanted them to be. I was not walking away as a daughter who had simply cleared her name. I was walking away as the woman who had permanently revoked my father's power to define my existence. I was finally truly free. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people around the world.